1, 2, 3. Hello. Right, yeah, so thank you very much. It's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have a lot to live up to from yesterday's presentations. Those who saw them will know exactly how good they were. So you can go now if you want, honestly. Today we're going to talk about literal injustice, the inequalities of dyslexia. Very quickly, I'm just going to explain what I mean when I say that. First of all, I'm going to set the groundwork for what is injustice. Then we're going to look at types of dyslexia-focused injustice. And then we're going to have a very quick look at what we can do about that, breaking in. So we break out the in from justice. So we create justice from injustice, hopefully. Before we do, I've got a question for you. Here we go. Here's a very famous optical illusion. Shouting out from the audience, what do you see? Anything, what do you see on this picture? Yeah? Yeah? Oh, you see a big nose? Okay, so you see some people, you see this one, someone saw a big nose. You see a man, yeah? You see 3 people and a swan. You don't see the nose and the man. You do see the nose and the man as well. It's really interesting. What you actually see, depending on who you are, some people will claim that at the very beginning, what you see is you see the data, the colors, the shapes, the angles. Some people disagree with this, but a lot of people say you see the data, the color, the shapes, and the angles. And you need to see these things before you see, as it were, the people, the animals, the scenery. Underneath that, so first of all, the first layer, you've got the colors, the shapes, the angles. Underneath that, you see the people. Underneath that, you interpret. You see the hidden faces. You see the expressions. You see the emotions. Underneath that, here's something else you might see. You might see norms, patriarchal notions of beauty. You might see ableism. These beautiful people, they're beautiful. It's a lovely scene. How many of them are in a wheelchair? None of them. Because we don't assume that if we're drawing a picture of beauty, there's people in wheelchairs or people on crutches. So there are underlying norms and assumptions within this picture. And if we recognize that, then we start to recognize ourselves. We start to recognize the norms and the assumptions that we have within ourselves. Now, this is really important because it's these underlying norms and assumptions that give us notions of right and wrong, that give us notions of moral and immoral, ethical and unethical. They underline our notions of normativity. They underline our notions of fairness. They underline our notions of everything. So let's just apply this for a quick second. Let's just apply this to dyslexia. What I've done is I collect one of my hobbies. I'm a geek. One of my hobbies is I collect data about dyslexia. And so I'm going to show you this data in a second. But first, let's have a look at this. When we talk about injustice, when we talk about rights and wrongs, we talk about justice, we talk about these things. First of all, justice is to do with desert. What you deserve, what you don't deserve. So, for instance, something happens to you, you don't deserve it. This is inherent within our notions of justice and injustice. It's imposed, sometimes from people, sometimes from institutions, sometimes from the law, sometimes from your school. So it's always about whether you deserve something and what's been imposed upon you. It's about what's fair and our understanding of what's fair. And you feel there's a lack of fairness. So when there's an injustice, you feel a lack of fairness. It's about inequality, deeply ingrained within our notions of injustice, our inequality. And those people who ever felt an injustice will probably feel that wasn't equally apportioned around people. There's a notion of power, again. Injustice is always to do with power. The ability to impose something that is unfair or that is not your just desert is always about power. And finally, it's about human beings. Nobody ever feels that the big wall in front of us is unjust. But we feel that the people who built the wall in front of us might be unjust. Or there might be an injustice to do with the people who built the wall. The fact is very seldom about justice. The mountain isn't about justice, but the fact that somebody hasn't given us the necessary equipment to climb the mountain might be about justice. Now, this relates to dyslexia because of this. It's about ethics. It's about ethics. It's about this notion of right and wrong. So let's just have a look. I said I collect definitions of dyslexia. we heard yesterday, especially in the international panel, that there are almost no two definitions of dyslexia that are the same. Here, for instance, in Britain, well, this is really interesting. I'm going to change this in a second because it's fascinating. In Britain, we used to operate with two things. The Rose definition, which called dyslexia difficulties in phonological awareness, verbal memory, verbal processing speed. The British Dyslexia Association called it a learning difference, primarily affecting reading and writing skills, and also about information processing. Recently, both of these have been replaced by something called the Delphi definition of dyslexia, which removes this idea of a learning difference and talks about difficulties and weaknesses and disorders. DSM-5, some people mentioned that yesterday, a neurodevelopmental disorder with impairments in reading, including possible deficits in reading accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. European Dyslexia Association says that it's a disorder mainly characterized by severe difficulties in acquiring reading, spelling, and writing skills. The International Dyslexia Association calls it a neurologically based condition that affects reading accuracy, fluency, and spelling. And finally, the Dyslexia Association of Singapore, I'm going to get myself into a lot of trouble here, the Dyslexia Association of Singapore, if I've copied this rightly, calls it a specific learning difficulty, a developmental difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. Well, let's look at the norms underlying these definitions. The Rose Report highlights the difficulties. The British Dyslexia Association calls it a difference. DSM-5, neurodevelopmental disorder, impairment, and deficits. European Dyslexia Association calls it a disorder and deficits. IDA, condition, difficulty. You can see a pattern, can't you? Difficulty, developmental difficulty. This isn't surprising. I've collected dozens of different national official Dyslexia Association definitions. They generally come in four sections, four categories. They come in type, origin, effect, and value. So type, you usually get, sorry, this didn't translate very well. I apologize for the colors. Type, they call it neurological or biological, congenital, genetic, gene conditional, or this strange word, constitutional. Origin, developmental, acquisitional, hereditary, innate. These are all kind of different. Effect, they talk about phonology, literacy, comprehension, information processing, memory, sequencing. The American Dyslexia Association talks about sensory perceptions. And then there's the value. Condition, disability, disorder, difficulty, all the way down to incompetence and incompleteness at the bottom. And you'll notice in this value, all of them except one are negative. All of them. And by the way, I'm now going to say all of them are negative because the British Dyslexia Association talked about differences. They've replaced it with the Delphi definition, which replaces difficulties with differences with difficulties and weakness. Now, we know when this happens that it has a negative effect on people. So here's the thing. What we're going to do, we're going to play a word association game. Okay? Here's the first word. Dysregulation. Dystopia. Dystrophy. Dysphoria. Anything positive here? Anyone think of any other words beginning with dys? Ooh, dysentery, yes. I wasn't going to put that one, but thank you very much. They're all negative. They're all negative. Now, this is important, really important because of this. There was a number of studies conducted between about 2003 and 2018. They were all synthesized by the University of Birmingham. Within those studies, there was one by, I think, Pitt and others. And they decided that all these definitions of dyslexia can be categorized into essentially four categories, four types. These are patients, students, hemispherists, and campaigners. Let me explain these very quickly. Patients, that is, if we look at dyslexia in particular ways and use certain languages, we are on the patients category. These describe dyslexia as medicalized, pathologized, and symptomized. There's no cure for dyslexia. It's a condition. What are your symptoms? Etc., etc., etc. Students, they are the ones who describe dyslexia in terms of deficits, inabilities, and performance-related outcomes. Slow reading speed, phonological deficiency, lack of fluency, poor comprehension. Hemispherists, they take the hemispheres in the brain and they describe dyslexia as differences, processing differences, neurological differences. And finally, campaigners, they take an ethical view. They look at, they say, dyslexia exists, what are we going to do about it? That's change-driven, a kind of a social model of dyslexia almost. And what we know, according to these studies, is that however we define dyslexia, whichever category of descriptions we use, has an outcome on the people we use them about. This is really interesting. So if you use the two on the left, if we talk about dyslexia in terms of deficits or in terms of conditions or symptoms, it has a negative outcome on the educational and the mental health outcomes of the people we're talking about. If we talk about more hemispheric or campaigning language, it has a positive outcome on the educational and the mental health outcomes of the people we're talking about. You all wrote something on sticky notes earlier on. Sometimes, when there's a smaller audience, I'll get you to get up and stick them on different walls. Here, I won't. What I want you to do is I want you, if you wrote something negative, something deficit-based, something about slow processing speed, or it's a condition, or it's a phonological processing deficit, something along those lines, hold your piece of paper up in your left hand. Go. No one. One. If you wrote something positive, it's all about being wonderful. It's about whatever it was you wrote. Hold it up in your right hand. Go. 2. If you didn't write anything at all, what we notice is when we describe dyslexia, we often describe dyslexia with this value inherent within the description, these norms, these underlying assumptions. It's important because of this. Those who know that there are some problems with the Rosenthal-Jakobson experiment, but actually the problems were described as methodological. Actually, the methodological problems are not problems at all. There's been some really interesting research to show that the methodology was good. Essentially, in 1966, 2 experimenters, Rosenthal and Jakobson, took an entire cohort of elementary grade students, and they tested them. And they took the results, and they knew that the results were all kind of average. And they went to the teachers, and they picked at random 20% of these students. And they said to the teachers, these students, these elementary school students, all show signs of being gifted. We don't like this word anymore, but they all show signs of being gifted. And they told that to the teachers, and lo and behold, by the end of the year, this 20% of students had outperformed the other 80% of the students. Why? Did they just strike lucky? No. What was going on is when you look at a child who you think is going to struggle, and they're struggling to give you a good answer, you'll think, oh, don't worry about it, we'll move on. If you look at a child you think is gifted, who's struggling to give you a good answer, you give them a little extra time. The child who's struggling, you think is struggling, who gives you an answer that might not be right, is just wrong. The child you think is gifted is being creative. This affects the teacher's attitudes, and the teacher's attitudes affects the students, and it affects the students' outcomes. There's also something called the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is really interesting. Essentially, imagine that you're at school, and everybody at school gains certain units of knowledge in their lessons. Now, typical students typically gain, let's say, 3 units of knowledge per lesson. Those who struggle to read gain 1 unit of knowledge per lesson. And then after 1 lesson, you've got 1 unit versus 3 units. After 2 lessons, you've got 2 units versus 6 units. After 3 lessons, 3 units versus 9 units. But it's more than that. It's more than that. Because all the vocabulary you have affects your comprehension of the rest of your vocabulary. So if you learn vocabulary slowly, as Gita was saying yesterday, if you learn vocabulary at a slower rate, then it gives you a less dense understanding of that vocabulary. So actually what's going on is something more along these lines. This is the student with lower vocabulary. This is my wonderful scientific drawing, by the way. This is a student with lower vocabulary compared with a student with higher vocabulary whose knowledge is increasing exponentially. And you compare the two, and by the end of the school day, this isn't even the school year, this is just a few lessons. By the end of the school day, the student with a larger vocabulary has increased his or her knowledge exponentially compared with the other student. This is what happens with dyslexic students. And then by the end of the academic year, your school says, oh, we accommodate for dyslexia. We give them an extra half an hour in the exam. How is that going to help with this? It doesn't. It just gives you an extra half an hour to feel humiliated. That's what it gave me at school. I hated that extra half an hour. I didn't like exams. I didn't want them to give me an extra half an hour because I knew I was going to fail. I always say if they made me do a sit-down exam for my PhD, I wouldn't have got it. I can hardly even spell PhD for crying out loud. The fact that they might have given me an exam for it is hard. It's really hard. Then there's a third type of injustice, and this is really, really important. I make no cultural assumptions about Singapore. I usually talk about Britain and Germany when I do this. There's a type of injustice we call epistemic injustice. Now, let me very quickly go over what epistemic injustice means. We've seen injustice is an ethical thing about inequality, unfairness, just desert, and power. Epistemic is essentially to do with knowledge. That's what it means. It's that thing which is to do with knowledge. I often ask when I'm working in Britain or Germany, put your hands up, and if you want to, you can, but you don't have to. Put your hands up if you think your views have ever been taken less seriously because of your gender. Always women. Always women. Because men, we're the rational ones. We're brilliant. We're men. We're rational. You're women. You're really intuitive. You're not so rational, but you're intuitive. Yeah? This is this prejudice, this stereotype, this underlying assumption that people have. And what it means is that women are not taken as seriously as men are taken. Your views are not listened to in the same way that men's views are listened to. Now, let's think about dyslexia. Dyslexia. Deficit, weakness, disorder. The views of dyslexics are inherently not going to be taken as seriously. And this is an epistemic injustice. It means that we're not listened to. And when we're trying to advocate for change, the people are less likely to listen to us because we are not as rational. And it's really easy to change this. Really easy to change it. As I said, I'm not going to ask you to show anybody what you wrote on your piece of paper or your sticky note. But take those sticky notes. Take one thing that you're... This is your homework, by the way. Did you expect homework? You didn't expect homework. This is your homework. Take those sticky notes, and what I'd like you to do is if you put anything negative, if you put slow processing or struggles with phonological decoding, rephrase it. Deeper processing. Or takes longer to think, enjoys thinking longer, or prefers audiobooks. There's nothing negative about prefers audiobooks to reading. And all we have to do is rephrase the things we think, rephrase those inherent underlying assumptions we have about dyslexia. Because when we do that, we can take these negatives, we can get rid of them. We can focus on the two on the right. And by getting rid of those on the left, those negative outcomes start to disappear. It's the simplest thing in the world. It's a win. The easiest win you can have. You don't need to know about the science of reading to be able to do this. Because once you do this, let's take this idea of dyslexia injustice. The idea that we do not get what we deserve because of these underlying assumptions. The idea that the education we're given to us is imposed and that the teachers are imposing their values on the dyslexics because they think that we're not going to do as well. This isn't fair. It's unequal. And there's this power dynamic involved. And in the end, it is about human beings. And the lesson for this is simply this. If we can change the language that we use about dyslexia, just the simple words we use, that affects our underlying norms and assumptions. And if we can do that, it changes our expectations, changes the demands we place on people, and it changes the amount of respect we give to those with dyslexia. And if we can do that, we change everything. Because the condition of truth is to let the vulnerable speak and be heard. And if we change our attitudes to whether dyslexic people have as big a voice as non-dyslexic people, that's the moment we can let the vulnerable speak and be heard. And that's the moment we can overturn the injustice. Thank you very much.